I'd like to welcome back to the show returning champion, John Truby. How you doing, John?
Good to see you, Alex. Great to be back.
You were one of you were actually episode one of the Bulletproof Screenwriting podcast a while ago when I first launched this podcast, and it's been one of the most downloaded episodes in the history of the show, and it was fairly epic. If I remember, it was like at least 90 minutes. So
Yeah, we went
everyone.
on.
Everyone listening, strap in because it's gonna be it's gonna be a wild ride. Now, for people who don't know who you are, John, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've been teaching story for over 30 years now. Most of the students that I've had over 50,000 students, are screenwriters, but my work has been focused toward story in general, meaning it works for novelists, screenwriters, short story, theater, video game. Every medium there is all about telling a great story. And even though there are clearly some major differences between the mediums, I've found that if you know the techniques of good storytelling, you will be successful in any one of those mediums. So I've been really doing that, and also for the last over 30 years working as a story consultant, script consultant, and that's where most of my work has been done. I've done over 1,000 scripts, and it's what happens is typically a studio will come to me with a script that needs work. Obviously, they don't want to spend upwards of 100 to 200 million dollars making and marketing it without having a script that's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so they asked me, and then I'm coming in not as a co-writer, not as somebody who is writing dialogue, but somebody who is going to help them get the story right. And then, and what a lot of people don't realize is that most scripts that are actually made have other writers, story consultants, that sort of thing, come on board because it's just too expensive not to get it right. So that's what I've been spending my time doing, and I've found that trying to understand story is a lifetime commitment. It's that fascinating and it's that complex. And what I've tried to do is turn probably the most complex craft in the world into something that's easy to understand and easy to apply, so that a writer can write their own best work. That's really what I'm always about is helping writers write their best.
What I find fascinating from our last interview and from your book, by the way, which everybody listening, if you have not read Anatomy of Story, you're doing yourself a disservice. So you have to read this book. It's been out for a while, but boy, does that is as evergreen of a book if I've ever seen one. It'll still be fresh in 100 years. It'll still be fresh because story is story, no matter. It's going back to poetics.
Yep, that's right.
So, but one thing that kind of blew my mind when I spoke to you the first time, and I just never thought of it this way. It was like, you always think of the 3-act structure. You always think of the beginning, the middle, the end, the hero's journey, all of those kind of things, and Campbell and that kind of stuff. And you said something that was so kind of rocked my world and story. You're like, well, why don't you throw the hero's journey on a detective story? Let me see how that works out for you.
Yeah.
And my mind exploded because it was like, it just blew the doors off the concept that every single story is exactly the same, which it's not. So can you kind of delve a little bit into that?
Yeah, what you put your finger on is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that writers face, screenwriters face. They have these two basic models for how they think you're supposed to write the script and tell the story. One is hero's journey, the other is 3-act structure. And the problem is that they're highly limited. They're basically for elementary level writing. They're for beginners, and they simply don't work at the professional level. The reason they don't work at the professional level is different depending on which ones you're going to use. when it comes to hero's journey, the problem with hero's journey is that the beats that are listed there, those are the Joseph Campbell beats, those are valid beats. But those are the beats of a myth story. Myth is one of the major genres. I do classes in all the major genres. Myth is one of them, but there's another 12 or 13 major genres that all worldwide storytelling is based on. Either one of those genres or more typically a mix, a combination of those. Well, Campbell laid out very effectively the beats of the myth form, which is probably the oldest story form. The problem is, in the modern day, we're not just writing myth stories. And specifically, another criticism of the Joseph Campbell beats is that they're actually not just a myth story, they are the male warrior myth story. For example, they don't have anything to do with the female myth, which is a massive story form in the myth area. So the problem is, that's why I mentioned before, if you're going to write a detective story, which is a relatively modern form, you're going to be in big trouble. You're going to write yourself into a hole really fast. Love story, crime story, fantasy. Fantasy has certain connections to myth, so you won't be as big a trouble if you do it with fantasy. But even there, the story structure of myth and fantasy are fundamentally different. They're different beasts. And so if you're using a structure for myth to write a fantasy, it's going to take you down the wrong track. Now, when it comes to 3-act structure, that's an even bigger problem. Because 3-act structure, at least with Hero's Journey, those beats are valid. Those actually will tell a good story in the myth area. But 3-act structure is nothing. There's nothing in it. It's simply a way to break a story into 3 sections because it appears to make it more manageable. But really all it does is give you guideposts. When you say, I'm in the first act, well, you're in the beginning. And if I'm in the second act, I'm in the middle. All it is fancy words applied to beginning, middle, and end. And what I've always contended is it doesn't do anything for you in terms of creating a story. 3-act was really invented by a story analyst looking at a script after it had been written to try to see if he could figure out what was happening at each step of the process.
Reverse engineering.
Exactly. And unfortunately, in my opinion, this caught on and it became kind of the mantra that people would use. And I believe that it has caused more problems. It has killed more writers, writing careers, than any other single element in story. And that's why I've been so, adamant about over 30 years that I've been teaching story, that it's fine to start with it. That's great, because when you're first starting, you don't know what you're doing. It gives you a little confidence. It gives you a sense of, I can at least divide this. These events are going to happen in the first act, and this will generally happen in the second act, and this will happen in the third act. Well, that's helpful. But what I always then say is, now you got to move beyond that, because the professional storytelling, especially in screenwriting, is so much more advanced than that if you're relying on that and you think that you have now learned how to structure a story, you're dead. You're absolutely dead. I've had the privilege of interviewing a lot of big time, very successful screenwriters on the show, and I've talked to them sometimes on air, sometimes off. But from what I hear, I love talking about the hero's journey and all this kind of stuff with them sometimes, and they say a couple of these, these are $1 billion. I call them $1 billion screenwriters because they've worked on some very big shows, and they go, "Look, man, you can." After the fact, you can slap anything onto a story as far as structure is concerned. I can make it look like a hero's journey. I can throw 5 acts on it. I can throw 4 acts on it. I could throw 6 acts on it. It's just kind of like you're trying to it's not what started the process, but you can slap
whatever show you want on it after the fact. And the problem is that a lot of screenwriters think that that is the only way. And like you're saying, early on, it makes a lot of sense. But when you start getting into some more advanced storytelling, more advanced screenwriting, it's not just the simple 3-act structure, even though you can apply that onto it.
Yeah.
Like you can apply.
What I always tell people is that, they say, well, John, I applied it to my script, or I applied it to Raiders of the Lost Ark, or this movie or that movie, and it was there. Mm-hmm. And I say exactly what you just said, which is you can divide anything into 3 parts, right, or 4 parts, or 7 parts, or 10 parts. You're taking a pie and you're just making more slices. That doesn't mean that it's going to give you any techniques or tools to create the pie in the first place. And that's the big distinction that people have so much trouble with. And so hard to get them to go beyond that in order to really become a craftsperson at the highest level. And that's, again, what we're all talking about. What we should be talking about is, how do you write at the level that can get you professional work? And that means you got to be really, really good at all of these skills of story, including character, structure, plot, theme, symbol, and so on and so forth, that 3-act doesn't even touch.
It's fascinating because, I love the pie technique, because it's literally a pie, and I could look at the pie and I could say what the pie was made of, but I didn't bake the pie. You need to know how the baker did what the baker does, which is remarkable. So going back a little bit, when you're seeing screenwriters, is that the biggest mistake you see screenwriters make? Is applying this 3-act structure? Because like you said, Raiders of the Lost Ark, to my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the Raiders of the Lost Ark is a 5-act show, or is it not? Because you could cut it up into 3.
That's my point. It's totally arbitrary. You're adding an outside division to the process. What I talk about in the anatomy of the story is a story process that is organic, which simply means I'm going to track a main character working through a plot to get a goal. And therefore, what is actually sequencing that story is the development of that character as they go from first wanting the goal to either accomplishing it or failing to get the goal. And what is the internal change that person goes through as they go through the process, the external process of a plot. And that means that every story that you write is going to be unique, because it's going to be based on your unique main character, and nobody else has that character. And how you take that character, how you make them change. And so that's, whereas with 3-act, we've just taken any old story and said, okay, we're going to divide it at this point and at this point, and now we've got 3 acts. Has nothing to do with the main character. It has nothing to do with the more complex plot sequence. Now, to get to your question, this problem with 3-act, it is the biggest problem that people have, only because it prevents them from understanding how to solve the real problem. And the real problem that, and I base this on years of experience and thousands of writers, the real problem that writers have in terms of working professionally is they don't know how to construct a plot. Plot is the game, because we're talking about popular storytelling. And what drives popular storytelling in every medium, including screenwriting, is the ability to come up with a surprising plot that people have not seen before. Now, think about how hard that is, especially when you have people doing things like Hero's Journey and so on, which are hitting the same beats every single time. How are you going to come up with something that they haven't seen before? In fact, that's the biggest problem with Hero's Journey. I mentioned that it only applies to myth, but the other problem is that we've seen it so many times that everybody knows what's going to happen. It's boring.
Right.
So it comes down to this problem of plot. And why do I say it? Anybody who's been writing for any length of time knows the importance of a strong main character. Okay? So they study, they work hard to try to come up with and understand how you create a good main character. They know the importance of good dialogue, okay, which you do at the end of the process. And where they run into the problem is that when they think about, okay, now it comes time for me to create the plot. Well, they don't know how to do that. And there's no book that tells them how to do that. And so they think, well, I'll just figure it out as I go. And guess what? It doesn't work that way. You are not going to figure it out as you go. What is going to happen 99% of the time is that you start down this path of the plot. You're going to get about 15 or 20 pages in. You're going to run yourself into a dead end, and you're going to stop. You're going to run into writer's block. And you're going to think, well, this is some kind of psychological problem I'm having. No, it's not a problem of psychology. It's a problem of your plot. You don't know what the story is going to do here. And because you didn't think of it from the beginning as an entire plot sequence, you're not going to be able to get out of this problem. And so what I've been really pushing the last few years, all of the new work that I've been doing is all about how do you create plot? How do you explain to people how to create plot? Because it's very complicated. And especially, how do you create plot that gives your story maximum narrative drive? Because that's what the studios want. Studios care about three things when they get your script: narrative drive, and narrative drive. That's it. Because that's what sells to a worldwide audience. Right. And that's something like Raiders of the Lost Ark. What does it have? It has fantastic narrative drive. It also has a great character. It has some fun scenes, some fun dialogue. There's some great fantasy in there and so on and so forth. But what's really making that thing work? It's fantastic narrative drive. That is the definition of popular storytelling. And so that's where I've been doing all my work and trying to get writers to focus on, to understand, if you want to succeed at the highest levels, you've got to become a master of plot. You'll get the character. You'll get the dialogue. If you write a good plot with a strong main character, the dialogue practically writes itself. People don't think I'm crazy when I say that, but it's absolutely true, because then you're not asking the dialogue to do what it can't do. You're not asking the dialogue to structure the story, which a lot of people do. Right. So that's why I push so hard on this, on creating plot, learning how to create plot, especially plot with intense narrative drive. And that's, by the way, we're going to talk later about the story rescue worksheet that I have for people. That's what that's all about too. It's just, these are techniques to give you maximum narrative drive in your script.
Now, I was reading a book, the Stephen King book on writing, which is a fantastic book. And he said something and it always stuck with me. It was really, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, is that he's like, if you have to have the basics of grasp of the English language. So he goes, you have to understand this, this, and this, and it has to be instinctual, not because like when I'm writing, because I've been writing for a long time throughout my life, just as not even in creative, just generally, you have a kind of taste for what English is supposed to sound like and how it's supposed to be written, and basic grammar, and these are things. He goes, you need to understand this instinctually. If you're thinking about it too heavily, you need to go back to the drawing board. And I feel that with master storytellers, a lot of this is just instinctual because they've done it so many times. Like a master craftsman, like a master carpenter, like a master painter. There's certain strokes that they've done 10,000 times. Yeah. And if you try to verbalize it, it's almost impossible to verbalize.
I find that is almost always the case with really the top writers. They're very bad at verbalizing how they got there.
Right.
What I would say to a Stephen King or anyone else like that is, yeah, you're absolutely right. Once you get to that position where you're writing at that level,
sure.
But that's you don't need to analyze it too much, because you've already got it as part of your second and third nature. It's already embedded in how you think. What they never talk about is, well, gee, Stephen, did you have this kind of ability when you were 6 years old and first going to school? No, you didn't. It's by the time you've gotten through all your education and you've written all these books and you've made some mistakes and you obviously have done extremely well at the same time, that entire process is a process of improving and increasing the craft. Now, he may not be one who likes to verbalize it or analyze it. That's great. That's fine. But what I would say to anybody else who is not currently writing at the level of Stephen King,
which is not many, by the way.
Right. You don't have that luxury. Right. You do not have that luxury. And that's why when, in the Anatomy of Story book and the recent work I've been doing on plot, it's all about trying to give people techniques, specific, applicable techniques that you can apply to your story right now. And in doing that, you're going to master that technique so that down the road a few years, when your level of ability has gone way up, then you don't have to think, what was the name of that technique that I used?
It's in there.
Exactly.
But it's the same thing as, and I hate to use baseball analogies, but I absolutely love using baseball analogies, where you might have a natural swing, and maybe when you're 15, 16, 17, you have a natural swing, but when you start getting, that natural swing is not going to get you into the majors for you to be anybody of any magnitude. Yep. So slowly but surely, as you take more swings, you start getting coached. You start getting coached on technique here. Now you pick up a thing there or there. And then because you've been at the plate so many times, it becomes second nature. You don't even think about it. You don't analyze it. But as you're going up, you're analyzing that swing. You're watching it. You're really taking notice. But at a certain point,
you're getting feedback from that batting coach who is saying, "Hey, I noticed there's a little switch in your swing that you didn't have 2 weeks ago,
right? And
you haven't been hitting since then." And because you need that outside eye to say, "Look, that natural process, quote natural process, which is actually made up of multiple smaller techniques, somehow got out of kilter. And we got to identify that and fix it so you can get back to the natural swing."
So you're basically like a story chiropractor. You got to adjust the spine to get it back.
Get that spine, that structure working. But I use a similar analogy with basketball. I mean, if I wasn't writing and teaching writing, I would like to be a point guard in the NBA. That would be my second choice.
Sure.
Now, and I always, and this comes up when people say to me, John, I don't need to read any of these books. All I need to do is write. All you have to do to write successfully is to write. Well, there's a certain truth to that, right? If you don't write anything, you're not going to write successfully because you haven't written anything.
Right.
But to think that all you have to do is write in order to write at the professional level is nonsense. It's a similar thing of saying, I would like to play point guard in the NBA. All I have to do is play a lot of basketball, right? Now, that's going to take me a lot of time on the playground, right? I'm going to get a lot of time playing basketball. But I'm not going to get close to the NBA because, A, I don't have the natural ability, but much more importantly, I have not been getting extensive, high-level coaching since the age I picked up the ball. Right. You take a guy like a Michael Jordan, or for younger people than myself, LeBron
James, right?
Right. The guy is a fantastic natural talent, sure, but the guy has been getting coaching to refine that talent for his entire life.
And practicing and adjusting and going.
And what happens is we look at him when he plays, just as we look at a Stephen King book, and we see the polished product. We don't see the techniques the hundreds of techniques sitting under the surface that makes it look like he's just taking a walk in the park.
Right.
It's a lot more complicated than that. And to get to that level, or to attempt to get to that level, you got to learn those techniques.
Right. And it's the same thing with like film directing. Like, you know, you look at the masters and you just go, oh my God, like you look at a Kubrick film and there's just so much density in his technique. And he literally would wait 5-7 years prepping a film. So he had everything really, or Hitchcock or these kind of guys. But there is so much work that goes into that. That makes it the easier it looks, the harder it was to get there.
Yeah.
Many ways.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm sure you're asked by screenwriters, you're asked questions all the time from screenwriters, how do we get better, how to do this? What are some of the best questions you get asked by screenwriters?
Well, let me first start off by saying the wrong questions.
That was my next question, but now you ruined it, John. But go ahead. Oh, we'll start off with the worst, then we'll go to the best. Sure.
Yeah. Well, the worst is, see, it has to do with the underlying problem. Most writers think that the reason they have not yet reached success is because they don't know the right people. This is a business of connections. How many times have we heard that? Mm-hmm. And so when I would give a talk or teach a class, the inevitable question is, how do I sell my script? How do I get an agent? How do I meet producers who will buy my material and so on? In other words, it's not about how do I write better. It's how do I sell? And clearly, these are concerns. We want to sell our work. But I consider that by far the biggest misconception that writers have about why they do not succeed. And I believe that in order to succeed, you got to know what the problem is first. The problem is not that you're not connected. I find that 99.9% of writers, when they finally meet a connection who could really do them some good, mm-hmm. they don't have the material to give to them.
They're not ready.
And by the material, I don't mean they don't have a script. They got a script. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. But they don't want to say that to me. They don't want to say, hey, John, I don't think I'm a good enough writer yet. And I don't want to say it to them. But that's the probable fact, is what you need to be knowing, what you need to be asking is, technically, what is wrong with my story? Why is this story not working? Because the only thing that sells is story. So, when it comes time to the best question, it tends to be focused on if the writer understands that the real structural elements under the surface that are making all the difference. And what some of those are, that they understand the desire line. And so they'll ask me, is my desire line working? Because the desire is the spine of the story. If they ask me a question like that, I know this person has a shot to write a really good script, because everything's going to hang on that spine. And then if they ask me something like, the conflict is not working, I don't know why, that tells me also that they're on the right track, because after desire and spine is opposition and conflict. You can't figure out the opposition until you get the goal. This is a big mistake that a lot of writers make. They might think in terms of conflict first, and there's no goal to hang it on. There's nothing to fight about. You can't have people fight unless they're fighting over a goal. And that is a goal that both the hero and the main opponent should have. So when I hear people talk about these structural underpinnings of a good story, then I know that they're focused in the right area. And they may not fix the problem right now, but they're going to get it. Because if you stay focused on those kind of structural things, I always say, if you get the 7 steps right, it's really hard to screw it up. And by the 7 steps, I'm talking about the 7 major structure steps in any good story. If you get those right, you've got the DNA of the story. You've got the basic fabric and structure spine of that story. And then the rest of it is adding on the special details, the twists and turns, and so on. But if you've got the strong spine, if your opposition setup and conflict is correct, it's going to make that part of it so much easier.
Now, everyone's always looking at blockbusters and how to write this, how to make money with their scripts and all this stuff, and what makes a blockbuster. So I'll ask you the question, what are some key elements to a successful, popular film? Even though both you and I know, and I'll speak for you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the chances of a screenwriter who's starting out writing a $150 to $200 million script that gets picked up by a studio is 0.0000%. But I think that even if they're able to write something of that magnitude, it might be a good writing sample, or might get them an agent, or might get them, and God knows, it might get produced or picked up or something. Yeah. But what are those key elements? And do you agree with that? And what are the key elements?
I do agree with that. Your idea when you're writing that script is not to sell. It's highly unlikely that it's going to happen. If it happens, fantastic. But what you're trying to do is show that you're a professional. Right. That you are at the level that you can be hired, because that's where all the work is. Not in spec scripts. It's getting hired because you're a professional and they know you're going to do the job. And think about it. You got all this money that you have to spend on a writer. You're going to want to be damn certain that this person is going to produce, in this very esoteric world of writing and creating a new story, that they're going to be able to come in with a great script every time, including the time when I give them my money. So absolutely, that's correct. It's funny that you asked this question, because I always ask question to students when I teach my anatomy of story class. I say, what do you think causes a blockbuster? Why is there a blockbuster? And I usually do it in terms of, American movies by far make the most money in the world. Mm-hmm. So I always do it in terms of, maybe I'm teaching Berlin or Paris or whatever. Say, why do American movies make so much money? And they always have the same two answers, and it's hilarious. The first answer they give is, you have all the movie stars. And I said, okay, yes, true, but Hollywood has not been a movie star-based business for at least 20 years. Right, at least 20 years. And the only people who don't know that still may be a few movie stars left that are not getting paid what they think they deserve. But other than that, it's not a movie star business. Then they give the answer, well, you spend all this money on special effects. Right, yes, we do. All those Marvel movies, they spend a lot of money on special effects. But then I point out, there's just hundreds, thousands of movies that spent a lot of money on special effects, and they were bombs at the box office.
And movie stars.
Absolutely. So neither of those has to do or they're way down the list in terms of why is something a blockbuster. And the answer, and it won't be surprising hearing it from me, but it is true. I fervently believe it. The reason that a movie is a blockbuster is embedded right in the script. And it has to do with those key structural elements I was just talking about. The first of them being a desire line, a strong, clear desire line that extends through the entire length of the script, that the hero chases after with intense speed and energy, and will do anything to get it. Because what that does is it provides narrative drive, which does not depend on particular culture. Right. Everybody knows, I see a character with a goal, I like the character, I want him to get the goal, therefore, if I can see him blast through all these opponents trying to stop him, especially if he starts off as an underdog, mm-hmm. and then gets the goal, fantastic, world over. No matter what the language, no matter what the culture, they want to see that. So that's what you start off with. You start off with this strong spine, and I talk about this in the story rescue worksheet, which is it's got to be a goal with a clear endpoint. We have to know specifically at the end of the story, did the hero get it or fail? Now, obviously, most of the time they get it, and usually if you want a blockbuster, it's a good idea for them to succeed in the goal. But interestingly enough, it's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fact that he has that goal, and then he goes after it with intense speed and energy that makes all the difference.
I mean, Raiders, he didn't get the goal.
Right.
He lost the Ark of the Covenant. Right. It's gone.
Right.
It's in the warehouse somewhere.
That's right. Exactly right. And so it's the ride. And what the desire line is what provides the ride. And Hollywood blockbuster movies are thrill rides. And the question is, structurally, how do you get that? Well, the first and most necessary is you've got to have that strong desire line by a single hero. Now, once you do that, another thing you see in blockbuster stories is the opposition setup. You have to have one main opponent who is present and attacking for the entire story. Now, you hear that, you say, well, obviously, when I watch all my movies, there's always that opponent there. Well, yeah. What you're not seeing are all the scripts where there either isn't a main opponent, or is it a main opponent who's there for a while and then, he disappears for a while. And no, it's got to be one main opponent attacking the hero relentlessly. And then that's the tip of the iceberg, because then you have to have a support group of opponents, preferably hidden under the surface, so we don't see how these opponents are connected. They are connected. They're not always, but in the most popular and typically the best stories, the opposition is connected to each other in some way, but it's a hidden hierarchy. So this is another, because what does that do? It gives you ongoing conflict. These things, the conflict never stops. And it's also what allows you to build the conflict. People, when they talk, these 3-act structure people, they say, if you notice, they always have second act problems. It wasn't first act problems. It's not third act problems. It's second act problems. Because 99% of scripts go bad in the middle because the writer using 3-act structure doesn't know what to do with the story. Well, what's supposed to happen is that in this conflict between the hero and the opposition over the goal, you not only get conflict, you build conflict. And unless you set up this opposition in a connected way where each opponent wants to defeat the hero for a different reason and using a different technique, then you can create what I call this Gatling gun approach to the old Gatling gun, machine gun type of thing. Mm-hmm. Instead of okay, the hero's taking action steps to reach the goal. 10 minutes later, the main opponent attacks him. And then he goes another 10 minutes, and then the main opponent attacks again. No, if you've got this hierarchy of opposition, main opponent attacks, second opponent attacks, third opponent attacks, back to the main opponent, then the second opponent. Bam, 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 bam. So what you're getting is what I call the key to the middle, which is punch, counter punch. That's the key to the middle of the story. What you're trying to set up is a heavyweight fight between two equally matched opponents, and they are pounding the shit out of each other. And that's until you get to the very end with the battle, which is the biggest conflict of all, and one of them, probably the hero, is going to win. End of story. I leave the theater. I feel fantastic. I tell all my friends.
And this is why the whole Endgame, Avengers Endgame was such a monster hit. But what they did was they built it up over a decade of stories that built up those characters. And it was just something that no one's ever done in Hollywood, to the point where at the end, and spoiler alert if you guys haven't seen this, but at the end if you haven't, it's not my fault, guys. But at the end, when Iron Man finally does that snap, And that's a perfect example. Like Thanos is such a amazing villain because he's an unmovable object. I mean, and I love the way they set it up in Infinity War, which is the first part of that.
Yeah.
In the very, very beginning, they throw the Hulk at him. And we all know the Hulk is the most powerful thing we've seen.
Nobody can beat the Hulk.
No one can be. And he wipes the floor with the Hulk in 5 minutes. And you're like, oh, this guy. But that's just such wonderful writing and so beautiful. Like within that 1 minute, you knew this is someone not to be trifled with. If the Hulk just got his ass handed to him. And then it's just this constant beating that Thanos just beats on the Avengers, beats on them and beats on them. So finally at the end, it takes everybody to finally beat him. I was watching a movie the other day because, we're in the middle of COVID. So you start recycling old movies you hadn't seen in like a decade or two. And I was watching Borat. And I hadn't seen Borat in at least 15 years. And it's still funny. It's still funny to this day. But when you were talking about desire, even as a silly of a film as that is, he has this desire that holds through the entire movie is he wants to go and meet Pamela Anderson and marry her. And that drives the whole story. Without that, it's just a dude meandering around the country. It's
a perfect example of no matter what you do, you have to have a clear desire endpoint, even if it's as fakey as that.
Right? It's something. It drives the story.
But so what? Because it's what, and this, by the way, is an especially difficult problem that comedy writers have. They dealing with certain misconceptions that are killing them. And the big misconception that comedy writers have, they think it's you pack as many jokes into the story as you can. Okay, that is disaster right there. Because what happens is, what they don't realize is that a joke stops the forward momentum of the story. Because everybody's stopping to watch somebody fall.
Yeah, on a banana peel, right.
Dropped, and then we laugh at them. Okay, that was great. I really enjoyed that. Okay, you string too many of those together at the beginning without setting up a storyline, a desire line that you hang everything on. And all of a sudden, again, you're 10 to 15 minutes in, you hit the dead end wall because there is no forward story momentum. There's no narrative drive. The narrative drive is just as important, if not more important, in a comedy as it is in something like Avengers, which at least has the benefit of all this big violent conflict that
dazzle, right?
To keep you dazzled. But in comedy, no, you've got to hang those jokes on a storyline, and that is provided by the clear goal that the hero's only going to get to at the very end.
And it's silly, and for everyone listening who writes comedy, I mean, even as silly of movies like Airplane and Dumb and Dumber, which are classics in comedy, Dumb and Dumber, they're trying to get the suitcase back to the girl who he's fallen in love with, from a distance. That's the driving factor. Airplane. We got to land this and survive. We got to land the plane and survive. but it's they're not really grand plots here. Right. It's very simple, but the point is it's a comedy. We need something to hang the jokes on. And give an excuse to go where we're going to go with it. So an Airplane is obvious, but Dumb and Dumber, they're going across country. And they keep all these jokes happen along the way, but it's being driven by something. Because if there was, then there'd be no plot. It's just be two guys doing stupid stuff. It's Beavis and Butthead, essentially.
Right.
Which is now I wanted to also talk to you about, because we didn't touch this last time, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. Theme. Yeah. Theme is such an important part, and I feel it's something that a lot of screenwriters just don't even think about. It's like an afterthought about the theme of like, what are you trying to say with the story? What's the underlining, arc for the character or for the story? Like, what are you trying to say? Can you talk a little bit about theme and how you think about it?
Sure, Alex. So this is getting a little freaky because the thing that I've most been working on with the new book that I'm writing is theme. Is what I talked just before about the fact that the big problem that separates the top professionals from everybody else is the ability to plot. But we got to take that even a step farther. The real problem that even some of the top professionals have is that they don't know how to express the theme through the complex plot. That's where you get the double punch. Now, just plot on its own is great, and that's the essence of popular storytelling. But if you can also express a powerful theme through the plot, so it's not heavy-handed, the audience does not know that they're getting this life-affirming, this upraising theme in the story. And because if they think that's what they're going to get, they're going to shut down right away. But if you get it past their defenses, which you do with the plot, it takes however popular that story is, and it magnifies at least double and probably more. Now, let me give you an example. An example I love to use is The Dark Knight. In my opinion, the greatest superhero movie ever made. Mm-hmm. And I would challenge anybody to come up with one that's better. And I don't just mean that's fun. I don't just mean
the only one that I can think of, because you've thrown the challenge down, John. So I have to say,
go ahead.
Logan is probably in the top 5 with Dark Knight. I do agree with you that Dark Knight is.
Yes, and for the same reason. Because it's a superhero movie with theme.
Yeah, with a lot of theme.
So, a lot of theme, but it's done beautifully. It's done beautifully through the plot of the story. Mm-hmm. But for me, the reason that Dark Knight is even greater is I think the main character is more complex. Batman is a more complex character. In fact, I think he's the most complex superhero that's ever been written. And that goes all the way back to the original comics. But it's also the ambition of the theme in The Dark Knight is greater than in Logan. In The Dark Knight, he really questions the whole concept of the superhero. Because the superhero is essentially the religion of, it is a religion. It is the superhero religion. It is the idea that superheroes can save us. Now, what The Dark Knight then does thematically is says, is that really a good idea? Isn't it better, instead of putting all of our faith in some superhero or outside force that is going to come in and save the day for us, wouldn't it be better if we all decided we're going to get in and solve the problem ourselves and working together? And what he does is he sets it up with this great character comparison of, you've got the Dark Knight, you've got the White Knight, who's the prosecutor, who at least he starts off as the White Knight, and then you got the Joker, who is at the other extreme. He is darkness personified.
He's anarchy, right?
Right, exactly. And so, what the entire plot then is set up to express the theme of, is it good for us to have a savior? And the way they do it is the plot is totally driven by the Joker. Mm-hmm. And the plot is quite brilliant. In fact, if anything, there's too much plot there. The Nolans are the only people in the world that I would say they write too much plot. The rest of this, that's not a problem, right?
Right.
You can't have too much plot. But what they do is the plot is driven by the Joker, and it's really a sequence of challenges that become more and more complex that the Joker gives to Batman to solve. And by complex, I mean morally complex. They put Batman in a more and more difficult moral position. So, for example, who are you going to save? You're going to save your girlfriend, or you're going to save the White Knight, the prosecutor? Until they end with the biggest moral challenge of all, where he does the classic prisoner's dilemma with the two ships.
Right.
Do you blow them up, because you think they're going to blow you up. And so it's really, on so many levels, it's brilliant. But my point is, it's because that the plot is in service to this larger theme, that it had the kind, not just is why it's so great, it's why it's so popular. And this is what always surprises people. People think that theme is theme versus popularity. No. It's only theme versus popularity if you don't know how to express theme right. If you express themes through the dialogue by preaching and saying, okay, here's what you need to learn from our movie. No, that's not going to work, and people are going to avoid it like crazy. But if you express that plot like The Dark Knight, where you're doing it through the characters, the character opposition, and the plot sequence, then the audience just goes away thinking that's just the greatest thing I've ever seen. That's why, this question about theme is, if the problem with plot is people just don't know how to do it. They don't. Right. Because there's so many techniques involved. Theme, the problem is they don't know how important it is.
Now, I want to ask you this because I'm fascinated by the movie Avatar. Yeah. Now, Avatar, up until recently, and still arguably with the inflation, is the biggest movie of all time. Yeah. It has a very strong, some say overbearing theme. Actually a bunch of themes layered on top of each other. What made that film because it's so popular? Because yes, there was 3D and there was amazing visual effects, but we've seen amazing visual effects before, and movies have died. And what is it about that film that caught the attention or the fantasy of the world at such a level that it took a decade almost for a film to even, and Avengers Endgame barely creeped over 10 years later. Disney pushed it out one more time to get the extra 2 or 3 million it needed to just say we're the biggest movie of all time, even though it wasn't. But so what's your take on that film?
Well, again, Alex, it's interesting you asked me this question right at this time, because I think Avatar is such an important film. And is often so misunderstood. I did an entire class on it, okay. Like an hour and a half class just on the techniques of Avatar and why it works. And so, I'm not going to take up all of our time to talk about Avatar.
No, I'm sure the audience would be fascinated. Maybe we could do another episode just on Avatar. But
yeah, right, because I could do it very easily, having done it already. But the Avatar. James Cameron is, in my opinion, the best popular storyteller in film. Popular storyteller. And to a lot of people, that's kind of faint praise. That's oh yeah, he's, nobody's going to criticize him for writing a great film, or say that he wrote a great film. But those people would be quite wrong, because those talents, those skills are very complicated. They're very advanced, and he knows exactly what he's doing, beginning with how he combines his genres. This guy is the ultimate genre movie maker, and he always combines the same 3, which are myth, action, and love story. And that combination of genres, it doesn't get more popular than that.
Wow. I'm going back now into his filmography, and I'm going, yep, that's there. Yep, that's there. Yeah. Even Terminator, from Terminator 2, The Abyss, True Lies, Titanic. I mean, other than Piranha 2, but we don't count that one.
And it's important to start with the genres, because the genres are the story forms. And almost all of my work over the last 30 years has been really focused on genres. How do each of the genres work? What are the genre beats for each form? And then how do you mix them? Because almost nothing now is a single genre. And it hasn't been for at least 20 years, probably more like 30. And what brought it on was Star Wars. Star Wars was the first film to really mix multiple genres. And you see in the difference from Jaws to Star Wars. I think Jaws came out in 76.
75 Jaws,
75.
and then 76, and then Star Wars right after.
Right. You have everything before Star Wars, everything after Star Wars. Jaws is a single genre story. It's a horror story, right? Star Wars is multiple genres. And once that came out and the studio saw how popular multiple genres were for a worldwide audience, it's been that way ever since. So, and we were talking earlier about Blockbuster. And I mentioned, first of all, desire and then the opposition setup. Third one is mixing genres, multiple genres. And in the rescue worksheet, I have a place where people can tell me at least 2 and preferably 3 genres that are going to make up your story. Because what you're doing with the audience is you're saying, I'm going to sell you 2 for the price of 1. I'm going to sell you 3 for the price of 1. And in story terms, what it does is whatever beats you have for one genre, now you add a second, you add a third, you're getting incredible density of story beats. And what does that translate? Plot. It's giving you great plot. It's giving you narrative drive. All these things we were talking about earlier.
Because if you have a love story, that's a certain amount of beats that have to happen in that. If you have an action, there's a certain amount of beats that happen after that. If there's myth, there's a certain amount of beats that have action. So just by the nature of combining genre, you're just automatically have to have a more complex plot, purely because you're not just doing Romeo and Juliet.
Exactly. And one of the nice things about it is if you know the beats, of course you got to know the beats, but if you know the beats, it's practically doing the job for you. Because if you got to hit all of those beats, of course the trick is going to be, how am I going to combine them? How am I going to mix them? Right. How am I going to sequence them? And that's easier said than done. But once you do, then you've got a fantastic plot from beginning to end. And you're not going to have that middle that collapses because you don't know what the main character is supposed to do. You're going to have to be doing great stuff every 5 minutes. You're going to have a major beat happening. So that's the first thing that you get in Avatar. And all of the beats for each of those genres is there. You're also getting this very powerful theme. And yes, in certain ways, that is definitely overdone. It's heavy-handed. But there's enough in the theme that is part of the story structure that the stuff that's heavy-handed you can kind of, overlook, and you're still getting moved by it. Because you're still, what is the basic story? It's the basic story. It's a battle between a tech society and a nature society. And you're seeing what a tech society gone, without limits, and what it does to nature. And it's a horrible thing to see.
But if you look at Avatar, I mean, there's probably more than just 3. I mean, you're talking about man versus nature, or machine versus nature, as well. That's another kind of storyline in that as well. And there's probably a few other layers in there that we can't even see yet.
Well, those are definite important lines and elements. Those are not actually, and this may just be a semantic difference. I would not. Those are not genres per se.
So man versus machine, or nature versus man. Those kind of like.
Those are types of themes. Those are major themes. Those are major themes. However, one of the things I talk about in the Avatar class is that one of the reasons it was so popular is because it used what I call two new myth forms. Because what almost all writers in Hollywood have done for the last 50 years is, when they were doing a myth-based story, they went back and borrowed from the ancient Greek myths. Mm-hmm. And they just updated it. And that's great stuff, because those are great stories. But what Cameron did was, he took 2 new myth forms that nobody was playing with, and he made that the basis of this story. And what are those 2 myth forms? One is the ecological myth, and the other is, which takes in tech versus nature, and how do you balance those out? Obviously, we don't have a balance initially, and it has to be reapplied. But the other is a female myth, because what happens in this story, on the surface, it's we have a conflict between a tech culture and a nature culture. But what's really going on under the surface in story terms is you're getting male myth versus female myth. All that military stuff that comes in, all those guys, those are the Joseph Campbell male myth beats. But what he's doing then is he's putting them into conflict with the female myth beats, which nobody else has done. Nobody else is playing with. Except in the last few years, we've had a few movies that have gotten into the female myth, like Inside Out, like Gravity, and they're massive hits. And I always tell my students, if you want to have a good chance of writing a hit film in the next 10 to 20 years, write a female myth. Modernize the female myth, and it's half the population, and yet the stories that are about their journey have not been told for 3,000 years. Ever since the male cultures took over from female cultures. So, not to get too esoteric here, but that's the kind of thing that's going on in Avatar, that when we watch it is just really fun story in this, this great world and with great special effects and so on, and likable characters. But what's going on under the surface structurally is massive and very revolutionary, and it easily overcomes the obvious, quote, mistakes that are made, like, what is the desire line? They're mining for obtainium. They want to obtain obtainium.
It's a bit on the nose. It's a bit on the nose,
right? If that isn't a classic MacGuffin, I don't know what is.
Right.
But the point is, who cares? It's such a minor mistake, if you will, that the fact that he's doing all this other stuff so well and really so far beyond anybody else working today is what gives him those kinds of numbers at the box office.
And he did this. Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but he did the same thing with Titanic. Like, Titanic had no reason at all to be a movie to anybody who wanted to watch.
Yeah,
it's like, we all know the ending.
Right.
We all know the story.
One of the worst calls I've ever made, Alex. One of the worst calls I ever made. I heard this was coming out. I said, "Oh, what a disaster! This thing is going to be a bomb at the box office. I know what's going to happen."
$200 million? Is he insane?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But what did he do? He took the disaster picture structure,
right,
which is a kind of action myth-based story, and he added a love story. And what that meant was, the reason that disaster pictures, typically they'll have a certain audience, but they're not that big, is because it's really a crosscut of various people as they're being destroyed by whatever the disaster is. Right? But we haven't got to know any of them well enough to care. And so what does he do? He saves the disaster for the very end of the picture. Right. And the whole 3/4 of the movie is the love story about two people who we now really, really care about. And he adds that at the end onto everybody else getting killed. And then we've got a massive,
And don't forget, now you also have the anticipation of the entire audience knowing what is going to happen, which is a very rare thing, because it's just a story that the entire world knows about. So we all like, oh my God, we love Jack and Rose, but the ship's going to sink. Are they going to make? So that is an additional layer on top of it as well. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. Every time James Cameron comes out with someone, it's like I go, in James I trust. Like I might not understand it when he's doing it. Like, I don't think these next, on paper, 4 more avatars or 5 more avatars that he's making are arguably 10 years after the first one. Like, people are like, does anyone care? It's even relevant. I'm like, in James I trust. I
Yeah.
Whatever he's doing.
Let me put it this way. I have a lot more trust in him being able to extend the Avatar series than the Star Wars people have for extending their series.
Fair enough. And also, just like a lot of popular filmmakers and storytellers in general, from Spielberg to Hitchcock to King, even Stephen King, they aren't given the respect that they're due. When Spielberg was hitting, home run after home run in the late 70s, early 80s, he was just like, there was just a run. And King as well, and Hitchcock, but they were never, he's popular. Oh, it's popular. Only later in their careers do people go back and go, you know what? This guy's kind of a genius.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. But we, in the back of our mind, we associate popularity equals mediocre.
Right. Like pulp. Right.
It's pulp. It's neither really good. It's not really bad. You don't get that kind of popular success by it being really embarrassingly bad. Mm-hmm. No, it's just middle of the road. But in fact, there are some, and most popular stuff is middle of the road, but there are some who are able to, and I talk about it, this is an actual technique, which is to transcend the genre.
Right.
And it's something you actually do in the script, which kicks it up from what everybody else is doing in that genre. And it's doing something that we really haven't seen before, or we've seen it very rarely. And basically what they're doing is they're taking the traditional beats and they're twisting them and resequencing in some cases, so that even though it's the same general structure, it's, for example, a detective story, it's still a detective story, but the way they did the detective story, I've never seen before, so it's filled with surprises. And this is one, in my opinion, one of the keys, if not the most important, I won't say rule because I don't like that word, but it's pretty damn close to a rule, which is that your best chance of success as a screenwriter or in any medium of storytelling is specialize in one genre, become the best at that form, mix it with 2 or 3 other forms, and transcend it. Do the beats in a unique way that we've never seen. And if you do that, you get the rare combination of it's really popular and it's highly respected critically.
It's like Pulp Fiction. Like Pulp Fiction. Or recently, for example, I just mentioned the detective form, Knives Out. Yeah. The whodunit. Like, when was the last time we saw whodunit? Like Clue?
Right. Yeah, it does not exist in the movies anymore. It does not. The last one we had certainly.
Oh no, the Orient Express film came out a little bit ago as well.
But in terms of like an original, you're going back to L.A. Confidential.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, L.A. Confidential.
Again, is it transcendent? But basically, the detective form does not exist in the movies. It's all in television. And yet he was able to do it in such a unique way that we want to, leave home, leave all the detective possibilities we have on the TV and actually go to the theater and watch it. I mean, that was really quite original and ingenious, some of the things that he was doing. But that's what you want to do, whatever your form is. You need to specialize so you can master the beats. You can't twist the beats until you've mastered them in the first place. And it, by the way, just brings up another pet peeve of mine. One of the things that drives me absolutely nuts is when I hear, on these Facebook posts or these screenwriting places, they say, you have to learn the rules to break the rules. And the implication is that the ideal is to not have
follow rules, right?
Not follow any rules because that stunts creativity, right? Well, on the surface, that makes total sense. It's complete nonsense because what those rules are, what I always say is, well, if it's a good rule, you probably want to follow it. If it's a bad rule, no, you don't. But for example, if I'm walking on the top of a mountain, and there's a rule that if you step off of the mountain, you're going to fall to your death. You don't want to break that rule, right? So
Same thing goes with story.
it was story. There are certain things that you want to do. You want an active main character driving the story. Right. You want to have a single main character who can focus the conflict and so on. You want other opponents who can create a density of attack and so on and so forth. There are certain rules that are really useful. And this is the way genre works as well. Those beats are rules. Those are beats that must be there, or it's not the form. If you don't have a first kiss in your love story, you're dead. But once you got that, then you have to do it a unique way.
But isn't it true though? Like I've seen this happen with directors, with screenwriters. They're so invested in showing that they do not adhere to these rules that they'll go out on a limb to do something that's so outside the box of rules, and it doesn't work. So it's the equivalent of me going up, or like Happy Madison, if you remember that one with Adam Sandler where he was the golfer. He played golf with a hockey stick because that's the way he knew how to do it, and it worked for him. But generally speaking, if I show up to a golf course and I'm going to drive with a hockey stick because it's not the rule,
right?
I'm not going to make it. There's certain things in a golf swing, in a golf club, there's certain basics that you need to do. Now, once you're Tiger Woods and you've swung that, if you want to bring out a hockey stick, I'm going to watch Tiger Woods with a hockey stick and see how it works out.
But he's not going to do it if he's trying to win that tournament. Right. See, that's the thing. These rules are there because they work. And the point is not to be slave to the rule. And that's why I always say, learn the beats of the genre, but don't break those beats. Don't say, oh, I'm beyond these beats now, I don't have to have them at all. No, do the beats in a way we haven't seen before.
Like Cameron,
exactly. Yeah. So, but this thing about genres and how you deal with genres, that's the game. That's the ball game now. In every medium, in worldwide storytelling.
I've just never again, once again, John, you've made me think about story in a completely unique way, because I on a visceral level, I understood what you meant, but I never consciously thought about combining genre before. But like, yeah, he's right. It's an action mixed with myth, mixed with a love story, and he's done it all his career, and he's been extremely successful. And with even the Secret Agent, True Lies, story, which again on paper, it sounds like it doesn't sound like it does. But when you start looking at a movie like True Lies or The Abyss, even, I mean, it's a love story. At the end of the day, The Abyss is a love story that happens to have sci-fi and aliens and some cool action in it. And then he also, don't forget, he always throws the technical. Right. Prowess over it, which a lot of screenwriters don't have that capability because they don't have a James Cameron in there. So he's a very unique style filmmaker as a whole package. It's just nobody, not Ridley Scott, not Nolan, not Fincher, not Kubrick. There's just nobody that's had his combination of stuff and how he does it.
But also keep in mind that it's so often forgotten, and I'm a huge believer in screenwriter as auteur. Mm-hmm. I do not believe, I think the director-auteur theory is one of the stupidest things that anybody ever came up with. And every time I teach my class in Paris, I make it a point to tell them that, because that's where it came from.
Of course.
And it's spread here. But some of the directors you mentioned write their material, but some of them don't. Yeah. And the thing about Cameron, which is why he's been able to get this consistency of not only quality, but consistency of popularity, is that he's always a co-writer on it, or the only writer on it. And what that allows him to do is he's creating it from the structural position. When a director comes onto it, you can change certain things, but the structure is there. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be messing with that unless you want massive cost overruns. So that's why I always look at the screenplay, even though it's not fashionable. Everybody else likes to throw around their directors, but to me, it's the unknown screenwriters or writer director that is really where you need to look at for what are the techniques from why this thing is working, and then B, why is this person so good at it? What is their skill level? And Cameron has just consistently done it over years and years and years.
His entire career, over decades of work. Now, I wanted to touch upon the villain a little bit and how to really write a really good villain. And I would love to use, because we spoke about him earlier, I think there's just it's such a wonderful teaching tool, the Joker and Batman, specifically in The Dark Knight. I just don't think that there's been, in recent history, a villain written so beautifully, and it's so perfect for that hero. You throw the Joker in Avatar, not so much. It doesn't work because he's not designed for that world. But because of he's literally the mirror image of Batman, and that's what a good villain should be. Correct?
Yeah. Yes. Well, but the question is, what does that mean?
Yes.
And you're absolutely right, but what does that mean?
Right.
Yes, I agree. The Joker is one of the all-time great opponents in movie history. Certainly, it is, I would say, one of the two keys for my opinion that it is the best superhero ever made. One being the fact that the original main character has got so much. He's not this Superman type of character. He is a human being who is deeply flawed and troubled.
But before
starting with that, you can't do anything else.
But can I stop you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Is Batman that amazing of a character and superhero without a Joker?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
But he cannot get to that level.
Mm-hmm.
He gets to his highest level
because of the
in
Joker.
Dark Knight because of the Joker.
Mm-hmm.
But the original source material, the reason that any Batman movie is going to be better than any Superman movie is because the original main character is human and he is his flaws, what I call the first of the 7 major structure steps, the weakness need. He's got so much weakness need and so much ghost, so much stuff that has been troubling him for his whole life, that anytime he goes into a story, you're automatically in a 100-yard dash, you're at the 50-yard line. I mean, it's a tremendous advantage. But having said that, no, he cannot get to the heights of a character without the Joker, because, and I talk about this in the Anatomy of the Story, is the opponent is probably the most important single element in a story, because the opponent is what causes the hero to change. Without the attack of the opponent, the hero is not motivated to change. They're not motivated to look at the great internal flaw that starts the whole story and say, hey, this is not working for me. I'm getting my clock cleaned by this opponent, and the only way I'm going to beat him is if I deal with what's really the problem here. So that's number one. And I always say in the Anatomy of the Story, the hero learns through the opponent. And that's an incredibly important principle in story right there. Another key principle is that the hero is only as good as the person he fights. Because, and I always use the analogy of a tennis match or a game, a sport, which is that each character drives the other to greatness. It's because of the conflict between them that each is forced to dig down. Not just one, not just the hero. Each is forced to dig down and come up with their best stuff. And then they make that punch, and then you get the counter punch. And it's testing each of them to their fullest capability. And so that when you get character change at the end for the hero, in really great stories, you're also going to get character change for the opponent. Now, you look at the Joker. The Joker is very misunderstood, in my opinion. When it came out, most critics talked about him as this nihilist, that he had nothing of value. Not so. He very definitely has a value system, but it's just a very dark value system. And his value
he has a point of view. He has a definite point of view.
Right. And in fact, the entire movie is a thought experiment conducted by the Joker to prove his view of humanity, which is humans are simply animals with a thin veneer of civilization. And you put them in the slightest bit of trouble, and that veneer is going to get washed away, and you're going to see what they really are, which is they're going to eat you alive. And so that's why he gives Batman these increasing moral challenges, because he's trying to prove it. And to me, the brilliance of the prisoner's dilemma thing with the ships at the end is just, one of the all-time great beats. The big problem I have with it, and the biggest problem I have with the whole movie, I didn't believe the decision.
It was too optimistic. It was too optimistic.
Yeah, you're telling me that a ship full of regular people versus a ship of criminals, murderers, and so on, that they are not going to blow up the criminal ship before the criminal ship can blow them up? It's not believable. To me, it's not believable. But having said that, the construction of it and the fact that the Joker drives the story is one of the keys to the success of this thing. And it's a technique. I talked before about plot is the biggest problem that writers have, and that's because there are more skills and techniques that go into plot than all the other writing skills combined, and people just don't know what they are. And in my opinion, the single most important plot technique of all is start with the opponent. Because what a plot really is, so we think of plot, this is one of the great misconceptions, this is one of the things I've been working on over the last few years in trying to come up with a way to explain plot to people that they could actually use, because it's so hard to get, is that plot, we think of plot as the sequence of actions that the hero takes in going after the goal. And that is, on the surface, what is happening. And that's why we always talk about plot as what happens next. Well, except the real question is, what causes what happens next? And what causes what happens next is the main opponent. And that's why what a plot really is a sequence of actions covering the entire story that the opponent comes up with to put the hero in the greatest amount of trouble. If you think of plot that way, all of a sudden, how to plot your story it may not just suddenly come to you fully blown, but you're about 50% there. That's how important that concept is.
But so, I never thought about this, but after thinking about it, you're right that the Dark Knight, Batman is not the one driving the show. Batman's doesn't have a need that needs to be fulfilled. The Joker has his thesis he needs fulfilled, and everybody around him is addressing the Joker's craziness.
Right.
So it's not. Batman does eventually change towards the end, obviously, and he makes that sacrifice and he does all the things that he does, but he's just constantly reacting to the Joker. The Joker is the spine of the movie, which is also unique because there's not many popular films that have the villain as the driving factor.
No, and it appears on the surface to contradict what I said earlier. We always want an active hero. Well, Batman is quite active.
Oh, very.
It's just and we are tracking his actions in trying to catch the opponent. So in that sense, we could say that the plot is the actions Batman takes to catch the Joker. And so he's very active in that sense. But the key to plot is that this sequence of actions that the opponent is taking are mostly under the surface. We don't see that. And the hero doesn't see it. And that's why we get reveals. That's why we get surprise. It's because what is this? What is a reveal? And plot is based on two major things, conflict and reveals. What is a reveal? A reveal is basically where the hero and the audience realize the move of the opponent. Oh, they just pulled that. I didn't know that. That's going to cause me a big problem. And now I have to deal with it. That's a reveal. So the point is that you want to start from the point of view of the opponent. Come up with a sequence of actions they're going to use to defeat the hero, and then hide most of them. And then the sequence of the story is the hero going after his goal, discovering various things that his opponent is doing to try to keep him from getting it. If you use that sequence, that process, writing process, you're 100 times better off than if you do it the normal way, which is, here's my hero, there's my goal, he's going to take action 1, then action 2, action 3, action 4, and so on. It doesn't work.
So basically, without Pepsi, there is no Coke. Without Microsoft, there is no Mac.
Yes.
Because, Coke is only Coke because it had a Pepsi to fight. If it had an RC Cola to fight, it wouldn't have worked as well.
No, not going to work. Not a great story.
Not a good story. You needed the what is it? You needed Vanderbilt to go against Rockefeller. You needed those. You need the giant industries. Those two. And at the end of the day, it's two characters that have to battle it out.
That's right.
Good versus bad, and
that's why I always tell writers, never think of your hero and opponent as two separate characters. Yes, they are separate
two
characters,
sides.
But in fact, it is the relationship between them is the most important relationship in the entire story. And that's what you constantly want to be aware of, is the relationship between the two of them and how it goes back and forth as each one gets the upper hand. So
Batman Begins, if we could, because I'm a huge Nolan fan, and I do agree with you. Sometimes he has too much plot, because sometimes you're just like, that hurt. I can't. Just blow something up, Chris. I can't think that hard right now. I mean, Inception. You're just like, I don't know what's going on, but this is a fun ride. But so Batman Begins. He basically revamped the entire Batman myth, and he did it in a beautiful way. And when I saw Batman Begins, I was like, well, this is the best superhero movie ever made. Then The Dark Knight showed up, and it was like, oh my God, this is just at a completely different level. Yeah. Then Batman Dark Knight Rises shows up, and arguably the weakest of the three, but yet I'll put it up against almost a lot of other superheroes. Right. So what made that film not work nearly as well as The Dark Knight?
Yeah. One of the great questions, one of the all-time great questions.
Because it's good. It's good.
It's really good.
It's good.
Really good. But it's not as good as the other two, and it's not as good as he wanted it to be. Because it was I'm such a fan of his and such a fan of the two movies that came before it. I did a breakdown of that film. It's on my website, truby.com, and where I talked about how could this go wrong. And in my opinion, first of all, it's because it is too ambitious. He went into it saying, okay, I've just done The Dark Knight.
He made The Godfather. He was trying to make The Godfather too. He was
movies, right?
Yeah.
I've just done on that level.
Sure.
How do I top that? And in my opinion, in trying to top it, it was so ambitious. It's basically an analysis of a revolution in a society. How do you in The Dark Knight, you have the problem of a savior, but the society is still pretty much where it's at. You know, Batman takes the hit so that they won't rely too much on a savior, and he'll be the bad guy, so that we don't get into this superhero cult. Okay, but it's still basically the same society. Well, in The Dark Knight Rises, he's trying to say, okay, how do we actually create a greater society? This is the classic question of science fiction, but he's trying to do it in the crime fantasy combination of genres. Super hard to do. But if you look at it, there's a number of beats from the French Revolution. And what in the breakdown way of what I talk about is I always take it down to the basic structure. I mentioned in the beginning, when you get those 7 steps, it's really hard to screw it up. And in my opinion, he put so much superstructure in terms of the ambitions of what he was trying to tell in that story on a desire line that could not handle it. And I think I talk about it in the breakdown as a bridge too far.
He just was a little too ambitious, slightly. But he still landed in places that most filmmakers and screenwriters would kill to do.
Yeah. But the problem is, without an urgent desire line tracking the entire story.
Right.
Because you have a large chunk where, as I recall, I haven't seen it since it came out. It just basically exactly. There's no desire line. It sits there. There's no urgency at all. And when you don't have the spine at the base, the whole superstructure collapses, and it's spinning its wheels. Whereas, what they sometimes do is it's plot for plot's sake. And that's where that big theme, that ambitious theme, without the process, without the plot and the structure underneath it to drive it, then it becomes over the top. It becomes a little on the nose, and you don't get any story urgency. You don't get any narrative drive, and so it gets really tiring.
Yeah, and if I remember the movie correctly, there was a moment when Batman's thrown into the pit with a broken back after he battled Bane.
Yeah.
The story just sits there for about 20 to 25 minutes. Everyone's kind of walking around Gotham. He's taken over. It's a few weeks. The cops are trapped underneath there's nothing. Right. There is no drive, and then it picks up again. But that's
exactly the point. It's one of the, because I couldn't remember that, but now
who broke his back? He's in the pit. He's in the pit.
He's not doing anything. The movie is not doing anything.
Right. And Bane isn't a bad villain. He's actually a very well written and good and obviously well performed villain. But and he has a very specific. And that's the one thing that all the villains actually had, even from Batman Begins. They all had very specific points of view. And Bane had a similar idea that the Joker wanted, but just he believes that this is going to happen, and this is my thesis, and I'm going to prove to you, Batman, that this is my thesis. Yeah.
Villains are really good at opponents. They're really good at that because they know that's the trick to driving the plot that they want to drive. But also just in terms of character sense, one of the things I always push is, in fact, I make the case that even using the term villain is a problem for a lot of writers, because when we think of villain, we think of this very simplistic, evil character.
Twisting the mustache, right?
Yeah, and it's so important. I always try to push writers, make the main opponent as complex a character as your hero, because that is going to give you benefits up and down the line, not just in terms of character, in terms of the emotion that the audience has for the story, and especially in terms of the plot. It's just super important.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at someone like, one of my favorite films of all time, I've spoken about many times on the show, Shawshank. I mean, the villain of the warden, and he had like 3 major villains: the prisoner, the main guard, and the warden is the ultimate villain. I mean, I think that's why it's so satisfying when Andy finally breaks free, and then just screws everybody along the way. It was such a brilliantly written story.
It really is terrific. I love that movie. Love that movie.
Yeah, it is. It's probably one of the most perfect scripts I've ever read, and one of the most perfect films I've ever seen. But I would argue, going back to Batman, that Batman Begins could be The Godfather, where Dark Knight's Godfather 2. I could argue that.
Yeah, but where I would disagree with you is on the Godfather ranking. I strongly feel that you look at these charts of
who's the best
trilogies,
right?
And it's got Godfather near the top, Godfather 2 a little higher, and then Godfather 3 is way down here.
I just saw that chart fly through Facebook. Right. There was like all the trilogies and fair. But, to be fair,
my contention is Godfather 2 is not the movie that Godfather 1 is. Why? Because every beat in Godfather 2 was first done in Godfather 1.
Right. It's the foundation.
It's the foundation. But
right.
I mean, literally every single story beat throughout the plot is in Godfather 1. The difference is that in Godfather 2, they get that cross-cut structure. And so you're comparing the gangsters. You're comparing the gangsters at the different generations. But in terms of my anatomy story, they do an extensive breakdown of the Godfather.
Right.
And it's just one of the most beautifully written. Yes, it's great direction and so on. But I look at it from the point of view of storytelling, of writing a screenplay.
Coppola's a master.
It is at every level, from structure through dialogue, every level, never been done better. And in my opinion, and I also tend to give a little bit more credit, just as when they're assigning credit in a screenplay, the original writer to me is always gets most of the credit, because the work of creating all of those beats is much harder than it is to adjust them later.
And polish, right.
And polish. And so to me, even though the polish job on Godfather 2 was incredible, all of the beats are right in Godfather 1. And, it's interesting, I talk about it in the class, that the Godfather 2 was affected, how he wrote Godfather 2 was affected by the response that Godfather 1 got, because it didn't get the response he thought it would get.
Yeah, he thought he was going to be fired every other day.
Well, that was before he even started, yes, and while he was shooting it. Yeah. But I mean, in terms of the audience response to the ending of the story.
Yeah.
What he thought structurally that he and Mario Puzo had done is create a character who, even though he's become the new Godfather, that morally he has become the devil. And the whole thing is structured to the connection with making the equation of Michael equals, or Godfather equals devil. And so he wanted to get something that's very difficult to pull off for a writer in any medium, which is a split ending for the character. Whereas on one level they have succeeded tremendously. On the other level, internally, they have fallen and failed. And all he got was people saying he succeeded. Isn't it great that he blew away the five heads of the families along with his brother-in-law and so on? Isn't that great? They didn't see the moral decline. And that heavily affected how he then wrote Godfather 2, to make Michael a much darker character and much more, not somebody we're going to root for so much as somebody that we see that this is a guy who is becoming more and more corrupt. So
basically, without Star Wars, there is no Empire Strikes Back, as far as it being that good. And without Batman Begins, arguably, there's no Dark Knight.
Yep.
You need the first.
Yeah,
in order to build upon. You can't come out the gate with Empire Strikes Back. It doesn't have the gravitas. No. Well, it's the same thing if you want to go back to Endgame. You can't have Avengers Endgame without the 10 years of films.
That's right.
That built up those characters to get to that crescendo.
There, in terms of to get a concluding film like that in a series, it's all based on what you did before.
Yeah.
All the setup work that they do in Marvel movies is amazing. Yeah. Amazing. And that's why, because you got this bank of characters, And they're great characters. They're great superhero characters. But it's obviously it's going to be in how you have them interact. And really, it's quite an interesting story challenge that they have at Marvel, which is, what do you do with superheroes? Because for the most part, they can't die. And we know there are exceptions to that, which I won't mention. But the point is, if they're superheroes and they don't have any real physical jeopardy, I'll always laugh at the fights in superhero movies because, one guy hits the other guy with a punch that knocks him through 3 buildings, but, he just shakes his head like a cartoon and then gets up and goes back to the fight. It's like, very quickly you realize, hey, there's nothing's going to happen in this fight.
That's why Superman's so difficult to get behind.
Exactly. But so the trick, the way Marvel handles it, is how they interweave and interconnect all the films of the separate ones, so that when they get them all together in the
Avengers, right?
The Avengers and the two sides, the villain team versus our hero team, where you're basically just taking the heavyweight fight and you're kicking it up another 10 notches because you're getting one all-star team against another all-star team. It's all been set up, years and years before with the other films. And that's why the payoff is so great.
And that's what sports are. Like, it's the Yankees versus the Yankees were always the great villains if you don't live in New York. If you're in New York, they're the heroes. But the Yankees in the 50s and the 40s and the 50s, they were just dominating. And the Bulls were that in the 90s, and LeBron James is that now, and so on. So there is that, but it takes time to build that. But I have to ask you this, because I'm sure my audience wants to know, since we've been bringing it up. I've talked about this ad nauseum, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. We understand now why Marvel works. Can you discuss and dissect why DC doesn't? And why they've had so much trouble in the DC universe, which arguably has some of the greatest superheroes of all time, easily the most well-known. Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are much more well-known than anybody other than maybe Spider-Man in the Marvel universe prior to launching of the Marvel MCU back in the day. So why is it so difficult? What happened at DC that it's still like, they have some one-offs here and there that are good, but they've not been able to create what Marvel has? No.
And it's a big subject, and I can't say that I'm an expert on it because I am not a fan, for the most part, of the DC universe.
That says volumes right there.
Right there. But then again, I don't, because of that basic superhero problem in superhero storytelling, I'm not as big a fan of the Marvel universe as some people are. Although I totally agree with you about the final film, the final Avengers film, and the one just before. But in terms of, there's certain one-off DC films, DC comic films that are really good. Wonder Woman, I thought was excellent.
It was wonderful.
And the Batman films, obviously in the hands of the Nolan brothers, are the best you get. But the problem comes in, how do you combine them into, like, the Justice League? It's the same thing. You're basically, for storytellers, it's the problem. How do you tell a story about an all-star team? And there's lots of problems with all-star teams, because among them, first of all, if you're going to have an all-star team, you got to have all-star opposition team. Right. And that means you got to establish all those characters. And you got to do all that work in previous films, so that it's not just 5 guys with different costumes on that supposedly each has a different major superpower, and then we're supposed to, that's going to be really good conflict and drama. No, that's not going to do it. That's not what it's about. But if you notice, what to me is the real key to what Marvel has done, besides what we're talking about, is setting up this stuff in previous films, which was I believe wasn't it J.J. Abrams they brought in? One of those, when they started to put the Marvel characters in conflict with each other.
I think Joss Whedon
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I knew it was a TV guy. It was a TV guy.
Yeah.
And that to me is the key right there. Because what they did is they brought in the knowledge of television. And television, I don't know if we talked about this the last time, television is so far advanced from above film right now. It has been for 20 years as a medium. And there's various reasons for it that we don't have time to go into. But one of the things that they do that is based on is because they're doing an ongoing series. They know that the real juice of the story, when you sustain the story, is you don't bring in a new opponent every week the way you do in a police show or a detective show, a character that we don't even get to know. No, you put the main characters of the show in opposition. That's where the conflict's got to come because those are the characters we care about. Those are the characters we meet and know every week. So what they did was they figured out a way, even though these are superheroes, figured out a way to have them fight amongst themselves. And all of a sudden, you get the fact that we care about these characters, we know these characters as human beings, not just as superheroes, but also we're getting the conflict-driven and building based on the characters we love. Then, typically at the end, they bring in the opposing team. That gives us the big battle. That gives us all the fireworks and so on and so forth, and we cap off the story. But what was the trick to the whole story was all the conflict between the heroes that led up to it. And to me, that's what they're really good at.
And also, I think the biggest thing, and I've said this a lot before too, is that the Marvel universe of characters, they're all kind of based, for lack of a better word, they all have vulnerabilities. Generally speaking, they all have vulnerabilities. They all can get hurt. Yep. Even Iron Man, even Thor, he's the only god in the Marvel universe. Where in the DC universe, they're essentially all gods.
Right.
You've got, other than Batman, who honestly is he's a Marvel character he's in the DC universe. Yeah. Because he's much more Marvel than anything else. But you got Superman, you got Wonder Woman, you got Green Lantern, you got the Flash. These are gods. Aquaman, they're all gods. And that's the problem when you write for gods. If you can't kill them or can't
that is the fundamental problem right there.
That's why Superman movies are so difficult.
Right. And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the 7 major structure set. First step is weakness need. If that's a god, they don't have a weakness need. If they don't have a vulnerability, you don't have a story. Because the whole story is designed to solve that weakness or to test that weakness. And so, that's why when I heard that they're going to have Batman versus Superman, I thought this is the stupidest idea you could possibly do. Now notice they're trying to do what Marvel's doing. They're trying to create conflict among the superheroes. But one is a god, one is superhuman, the other is a human being. It's not even a contest. It would take about 5 seconds.
Not even. It's like that's my wife, who is not a superhero fan, when she heard like Batman versus Superman, that's ridiculous. Superman would kill him in 5 seconds. Literally, that's what. She's not a fan. I'm like, yeah, that's why it's not going to work.
And I guarantee you, every person in America, when they heard that movie was coming out, the very first thought they had was, that's going to take 5 seconds.
And it took them how long? It took them like 2 hours to get to the fight, and the fight lasted 8 minutes.
Right.
And it was just so unsatisfying as a general.
Totally absurd. It was totally absurd.
It was completely absurd. But going back to gods really quickly, though, the Greeks, they figured out the god thing pretty well. I mean, if you go back to Zeus and Hades and all these. But what they did is they added human elements to all of these gods. Zeus they were all flawed characters.
Right.
And
a really important thing to keep in mind is that in Greek mythology, those gods are not gods versus humans. Gods are simply human beings taken to an nth degree.
Right.
And they're done that to show how humans really are.
Right, exactly. And that's definitely not what Superman is. So, John, I'm going to ask you a few questions that I ask all of my guests. What are 3 screenplays every screenwriter should read?
Whoa. Man, See, what I tend to do, because it's so important that people know the genre that they're writing,
Okay.
that whenever somebody will, what are the screenplays you think are great that you recommend? I always first say, well, what genre are you talking about? But given that there are 12, 13, 14 major genres that almost all stories are built on, I can give you some examples. For example, gangster, The Godfather, Godfather 1, and Goodfellas. I put them pretty much on the same level. Both brilliant scripts. If you talk about crime, you're talking about Usual Suspects. The best, I'd say, to come out of Hollywood in the last 25 years at least.
That was a 90s film, so we're talking about 30 years plus now, something like that.
And also, if you want to talk about, I mean, this film just blows me away, and the writing on it is so great. It's also, I think, in the crime. In fact, I call it a transcendent crime story, which is In Bruges.
Oh yeah, In Bruges, yeah.
Just absolutely brilliant. If you're talking about, fantasy crime, or the myth form, you're talking about The Dark Knight. Absolutely, you got to read that script. If you're talking about the action form, I've got to go back 60 years and to a different country. The movie that every action movie is based on, it's The Seven Samurai. Probably the greatest script ever written, in my opinion. Script ever written. If you're talking about a love story, probably When Harry Met Sally.
So
romantic comedy, it doesn't get better than that. That and interesting.
Annie Hall,
absolutely at that level as well. And going back many years, I'd say probably 80 years, to one that is I often like to compare to Harry Met Sally.
It happened.
It's actually a Philadelphia Story.
Oh, that's another one. Yeah, I was gonna say It Happened One Night, but Philadelphia Story. Also
great. So I'm just trying to think of some of the other genres. Detective story, I go with LA Confidential. Absolutely brilliant script. As good as that form gets on film. Now, of course, you want to talk about just great writing, then you got to go to television. The best writing in the world is done on television, has been for 20 years. Then I'm looking at shows like Breaking Bad, Mad Men,
The Wire.
My top five greatest shows ever are those: The Wire, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Sopranos, and the original Twilight Zone. And the writing, a different medium, but especially if you're interested in understanding how plot works and how to extend plot, you got to watch television. You got to look at how they extend plot over multiple episodes to create an entire season.
We should have you back just to talk about television one episode. Like that's all, because I know that we didn't even touch television in this episode, and I know that's something you're pretty passionate about. Yeah,
it's over the last almost 10 years now. The one class that I'm asked to do most often around the world is television, how to write for television, because that's where the quality is. And any country in the world can write at that level because it's all in the writing, and the writers are the auteurs in television, not the director. And when you put the writers in charge, that's what you get.
Touché, sir. Touché.
Yep.
Now, what advice would you give a screenwriter wanting to break into the business today?
You got to learn your craft. You got to learn the craft, and you've got to especially learn how to plot. It's as they say, it is the skill. It is hard to come by because there's very little written on it. And it's one of the reasons that almost all the classes that I've been doing the last few years are focused on that. But without that ability to tell a story that is going to please the audience, not just be fulfilling to the audience, but please the audience, you're not in the game. And it is, especially given all of the obstacles to screenwriters, much greater obstacles to screenwriters than, for example, indie novels, where a lot of writers are going now, because they got a 100% chance of getting their work out. 100% chance.
Right.
Screenwriters, you have a 0.0001 chance. So that's massive obstacle. The only way you get over that obstacle is you've got to have a plot in a genre or multiple genres that is so good, so unique, and so surprising that the reader, who is the gatekeeper and who is mentally, what's the word I want? He's mentally programmed to say no. These people's job is to say no. The only way you can get past them is to come up with that kind of a story with fabulous plot and incredible narrative drive. And then even a reader will not stop you.
And now you also said you had a gift for the tribe today. What is that gift you are giving us, sir?
Well, I've put together a worksheet that I think will immediately increase the quality of a writer's story a lot, just by going through the 7 techniques that I've listed there. And I've got a place on the worksheet for them to fill in their own story. And so it's I call it the Story Rescue Worksheet, and they can get it by going to www.truby.com/indie, INDIE.
Okay. That would be truby.com/indie.
Truby.com, that's right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'll put that in the show notes, John.
Good, John.
And I appreciate that, John. We can keep talking for at least another 2 hours about story,
Sure.
We have to have you on more often, because it's always a masterclass when you're on. So, John, thank you so much for being on the show and dropping knowledge bombs on the tribe today, man. Thank you so much.